Hello everyone, this is Mr. Mola for lesson 8-1, graphing f of x equals ax squared. So very similar, we've done this stuff before. Really the big difference from before is it usually said y equals ax squared. Otherwise, a lot of these terms and stuff should be review. We'll be talking about stretch and shrink and domain and range. There's a couple new terms that I'll throw at you, but most of this stuff should probably be review. So if you remember, these first couple want us to graph. So I like to pick the numbers -1, 0, and 1 for my x. So we're just going to plug those in. So instead of 3x squared, I'm going to do 3 times -1 squared. So -1 squared is 1, and then 1 times 3 is 3. And then same thing, we'll do 3 times 0 squared. 0 squared is 0. 0 times 3 is 0. And then for the last one, 3 times 1 squared. So 1 squared is 1, and then 1 times 3 is 3. So then as we put these dots on our graph here, we'll look at the graph and we'll see that it is a little bit thinner than the graph lined out in black, which is f of x equals x squared. So if you look at 3x squared and x squared, there's a 3 out in front. And if you remember, that 3 out in front means it is going to stretch by 3. So that would explain why this graph is longer and skinnier, or the red graph is longer and skinnier than the black graph because they stretch. It is getting stretched out. Okay, if we look at another one, kind of the same thing. So -5x squared. So I'm going to make my table. So here's my x, here's my y. And then we plug in -1. So -1 squared is 1. 1 times -5 is -5. Plug in 0. 0 squared is 0. And 0 times -5 is also 0. And then if I plug in +1, 1 squared is 1, and 1 times -5 is -5. So now if I look at here, here's my 0, 0. 1, 5 is going to be about there. 1, -5 will be about there. So a couple differences here. So yes, this green line is a lot skinnier than that one because it's 5 instead of 1x. And you also see that it is facing a different way. And that's because it is a -5x. So this one would have a reflection. And then also a stretch of 5. And if you remember, there was this website that we used to use to kind of do it. So for C and D, I'll just plug it into the website here. And so we can kind of see what's going on there. So we're going to go to Desmos graphing. And so I'm going to do y equals x squared so we can kind of see the original graph. And then the one they want us to graph is -0.2 x squared. So we can kind of see the difference there. So this one, it looks like, is not taller and skinnier. It kind of looks like it's shorter and fatter. And then also facing the different way. So since now we're talking about a decimal, it's not going to be a stretch anymore. This one's going to be a shrink of 0.2. And then again, since there's a negative sign, it is a reflection over the x-axis. So you can always use that Desmos. So especially some of the questions on the homework will be multiple choice. You kind of just need to pick the graph. So you can always do it for that. And then letter D was 1/10 x squared. So it looks like that. So you can see that blue line is way, I'm going to say fatter, because it's kind of shrinking down. So shrinks down on the graph and is a lot wider than the other graph there. So this one has a shrink of 1/10. Okay, we don't need to do anything with the reflection. They were both facing upward, so those were okay. If you look over here at the practice problems, all right, it says identify the characteristics. So when it says characteristics, it wants to know the vertex, the axis of symmetry, then the domain, and the range. So remember, the vertex is the lowest or highest point of the graph. So vertex will change depending on what kind of graph it is. If it faces upward, like number 1 does, then we want to know the lowest point of the graph. If it's like number 2, where it faces downward, then the vertex is going to be the highest point of the graph. So vertex, we're just looking for the lowest point of the graph or the highest point of the graph. So for number 1, our vertex is, looks like right there, and it is -1, 1. For number 2, our vertex would be over 3 up 4, so 3, 4. Okay. Then axis of symmetry, if you remember, is kind of the imaginary line that divides the graph in half. So kind of that x point there. So axis of symmetry we kind of already found when we found the vertex. The axis of symmetry for number 1 is -1. That's where the graph gets divided in half. And then the axis of symmetry for number 2 is 3, because that's where that line goes in half. Then if you remember domain and range, domain is pretty much always all real numbers. Okay, you can pick any number you want for x. It's not like you're limited to anything, so domain is all real numbers. Range is saying what are the possible y values. So it always starts with a y, and then depending on the graph, y's are going up here. So I'm going to do a greater than sign, and the lowest point that this y can be is right here at 1. So y has to be a number that is greater than 1. It's never going to be 0.99 even. It's never going to go negative. So every y on this graph is going to be 1 or greater. And then kind of the opposite here. So y has to be a less than, because the graph is going down, and it has to be less than 4. No way you can find a number that'll make it be like 4.1 or 5 or something. The graph is always going to go in this shape, and the y's are just going to keep going lower and lower. It's just going to keep going down. And then for the rest of these, it wants you to graph them. So again, you can either make the table or you can use Desmos. I'll maybe do one more and kind of just show you. Let's look at number, well, these are pretty similar. So let's look at number 4 here. So if I'm going to make my table, I'm going to do x, y. I'm going to plug in -1, 0, and 1. So if I plug in -1 there, so -1 squared is 1. 1 times -4 is -4. Plug in 0, 0 squared is 0, and 0 times -4 is 0. And then if I plug in 1, 1 squared is 1, and 1 times -4 is -4. So if I'm looking at my points here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, -4, my graph's going to look like that, facing downward. Okay, and then it says it wants us to compare it to x squared. So that means we're going to talk about is the reflection, if it has a reflection, and then the stretch or the shrink. This one is facing downwards, so there is a reflection over the x-axis. And then this one also does have a stretch, because it's a number bigger than 1, of 4. Okay. 3, let's pop in the Desmos app. So we have 5x squared. Okay, so there's that blue line. So again, taller and skinnier, it has a stretch. So everything is going up since it's positive, so we don't have to worry about a reflection or anything. We're just going to write it has a stretch of 5. It's pretty much the only difference between 5x squared and x squared is this one will have a stretch of 5. Okay, 5 is kind of tricky. There's no number in front of it, so this one's not going to have a stretch or a shrink, but it does have a negative sign in front of it. So if we compare it from x squared to negative x squared, well, the difference is that negative sign. And remember that negative sign just means it's going to have a reflection over the x-axis. Okay, kind of the same thing on 6. So we compare x squared to negative 7x squared. Well, first of all, it has a negative, so we know it's going to reflect. And then since 7 is a number bigger than 1, we know it's going to stretch by a factor of 7. And then for 7 and 8, it looks like these are going to be two shrink problems because both of these numbers are less than 1. So 7 is negative, so if I compare that, it's also going to reflect. So we're going to have a reflection. And since 1/5 is less than 1, it is going to be a shrink now, not a stretch anymore. Shrink of 1/5. 8 is positive, so we don't have to worry about the reflection, but it will have a shrink as well. So remember, if it's greater than 1, it's going to be a stretch. If it's lower than 1, it's going to be a shrink. Otherwise, all the stuff is pretty much the same with the vertex and axis of symmetry. So I hope this video helped remember some of those things that we learned in a previous chapter.